Ready? No? Okay. If you would turn to the book of Mark, chapter 14. And this is an extra long chapter, so it's taken us a little bit to get through it. And there's been a lot of things to discuss in this chapter. We're still in our study in the book of Mark. We're getting closer to the end. I don't know if we'll get through the rest of the chapter today. We'll see how far we get. That's 30 verses still, so but we'll see. It does all tie together, and would like to if we can, but we'll see how it goes. Remember last time we saw where the Lord he had instituted the Lord's Supper and gave instructions on how it was to be carried out and all that, and then he took his apostles with him to Gethsemane, the garden there, and and I believe I think it was last week we talked about this, how it where it's located outside the temple and on the will be on the Jerusalem side of the Mount of Olives. If you go over the mountain, if you will, there, you get to Bethany, where he was staying each evening after preaching and teaching in the temple during this time. He will not leave Jerusalem after this. The day of the Passover, when he came into Jerusalem for that Passover to observe the Passover, will be the last time he enters Jerusalem. And the last time that the day before is the last time he would leave Jerusalem and go back to Bethany. So he's in Jerusalem till his death, burial, and resurrection. He will not leave again. We talked about how Judas had made a agreement with the high priest and the other priests in the temple, how he was going to betray Jesus. He gave him instructions on how he was going to do that. When the time came, they were going to meet in the garden. Judas knew Jesus' plans. You know what he did every day. He had been with them for 3.5 years, remember? He knew that at some point after their meal, they were going to leave the upper room and go to the garden to pray. That was Jesus' practice. And that's what the garden was set up for. It was originally the garden of Gethsemane there was a place for people to go and reflect and to think and to meditate and to pray outside the temple and actually outside the walls of the city of Jerusalem. It was what we would call a park. You know, it was a beautiful place with lots of trees and they had built places to sit, or you could sit on the grass, whichever you wanted, on the ground. It was just a beautiful place to go. So that's where he would go to pray. And so he did this night. Judas knew where he was going. He told the high priest, when we go out there, I'll point him out to you. So let's begin with verse 43, and we'll get into the betrayal and the arrest. And immediately while he yet spake, cometh Judas, one of the 12, and with him a great multitude with swords and staves from the chief priests and the scribes and the elders. Now remember, Judas had left them. Well, they were still in the upper room. He had left them once Jesus had called him out as the one who would betray him. He up and left. He knew it was time. And I'm sure Judas, if you think, humanly speaking anyway, you think of criminals and what they think about, and you think, well, he's been called out now by his master. His time's short. He knows that at some point Jesus is going to exclude him from the group, and he would be ostracized. And so he realizes, hey, it's time. Well, we know behind the scenes, we know that it was the Lord himself directing Judas to leave at this particular time. It was prophesied of in the Old Testament. Jesus prophesied of it. And so this was God's timing, not just Judas's. Wasn't Judas's time. He didn't pick the time. He never. Matter of fact, if you go back and read about where he made the agreement with the priest, they really didn't have a set time. Other than Judas just said he would come to him when it was time. So, again, this was all planned out before the foundations of the earth. This was prophesied of old. It came with a great multitude with swords and staves from the chief priest and the scribes and the elders. Now, we'll see in a moment what Jesus says about this, but understand, there was no need for swords and staves, was there? He would go willingly. They didn't know that. They didn't understand that. But if you look at every altercation that the priest had with Jesus, he never was the one that got violent, was he? It was always them that threatened to kill him. It was always them that threatened to arrest him. It was always them that were threatening harm upon him or his apostles or whoever that was with him. He was never the one that, and he never showed throughout his whole ministry, he never showed any indication of being a violent person. Now, we know, can the Lord be violent? Surely he can. If you've ever seen his wrath on somebody or experienced it yourself, his chastisement, you know he can get violent. But Jesus was not here to be violent at that time. That comes later. And he that betrayed him had given him a token, saying, whomsoever I shall kiss, that same is he. That take him and lead him away safely. So this was Judas's instructions to he says a multitude here. If you go, and we're not going to take time to go there this morning, but if you go to the other three Gospels, you see where it was a small army. And the practice of the day with the temple was they had a small army within the temple. They were the guards, the temple guards. And you see, especially when you get into Acts, the book of Acts, and you see the Apostle Paul, and well, not just Paul, but Peter and John and others, James and John and others, when they would have confrontations with the temple, with the priests of the temple, they would always send out the captain of the guard, wouldn't they? Why? Well, he was the military leader, the military side of the priest. And so that's who this great multitude would have been. It was not the common people. These were all from the temple. Whether it was all, it was the guards, plus the chief priest and the scribes and the elders. And as soon as he was come, he goeth straightway to him and saith, Master, Master, and kissed him. Now, notice the first word, master, is in capital letter. He addresses him as a proper name, proper noun, if you will. Master as being a master, as Judas being a servant. But then the second master is not, because he's not speaking as his servant any longer. And remember also at this point in time, we don't know for sure when it exactly took place, but at some point in time, Judas became possessed by Satan himself. Jesus called him out on that, remember, before he left the upper room. Jesus said that there was one there that had a devil, and said it was even the Satan himself. It was, and so certainly Satan is not going to refer to Jesus as his master, is he? And he kissed him. That was, you've heard the reference of a holy kiss in the scriptures. That's what this was. This was a greeting They would have greeted each other with a kiss. And Judas, the first one he comes to, that was the instruction. The first one I come to and that I give a kiss to, he's the one that you want to take. Now, why would he have to do this? Remember, Jesus has been at the temple multiple times. Obviously, these men would have seen him before. But remember the description that's given of the Lord in the Scriptures? He was just a common Jew. He was not anything special. There was not anything about him that stood out. He would have had short hair and a beard just like everybody else in that part of in that country at the time. He may not, and we don't know what the apostles looked like exactly. He may have looked similar to some of the apostles. This would have been a way for Judas to make sure the guards didn't mess up and take the wrong person. And one of them that stood by drew a sword and smote a servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. Now this was, if you go, I believe it's in John where you go and you see this was Peter that did this, and the Lord rebuked him for it. And then proceeded to put the guy's ear back on. He performed a miracle right there as he's being arrested. He performs a miracle. But what about the chief priest and the scribes and the elders? They don't care. They have such a hatred for him. They don't even recognize this miracle of Jesus putting this guy's ear back on. And Jesus answered and said unto them, Are ye come out as against a thief, with swords and with staves to take me? See, he questions even, why do you come with swords and staves? I'm not going to fight you. Now we see Peter has a sword. At least Peter has a sword. What about the rest of them? We don't know for sure about the rest of them. They may have too. Remember, they traveled in a pretty rough part of the world at that time. Very possible they all had some kind of weapon on them for their self-protection. And remember also, Jesus has been telling them for some time that he was going to be taken and was going to be put to death. So in their minds, they're thinking, we'll stop it. Well, you're talking about at the most 12 men counting Jesus himself, at the most, against a multitude that have swords and spears. They're not going to stand a chance, if they were to try to fight. And of course, that wasn't the plan. He says, I was daily with you in the temple teaching, and you took me not. But the scriptures must be fulfilled. What does he mean by that? Well, he was there. If you remember, we've studied this. He was there in the temple every day from the time of his return to Jerusalem, where we saw him laying down the palm leaves and their clothes and all that, when he rode in on the donkey. His triumphal entry, as it's referred to, when he came in, he began teaching in the temple. And he was there every day after that. Up until this point, he was there every day teaching in the temple. They even came and argued with him. They even came and tried to catch him preaching false doctrine. They could have taken him at any time. He was bold enough. Why? Because he had the authority, for one, to be there. He probably had, I would say he had more authority to be in the temple than even the chief and the chief priest and the elders and the scribes and the Pharisees and the Sadducees. He was God himself. Why wouldn't he have more authority to be there? He could have thrown them out if he had wanted to. But the scriptures must be fulfilled. Why? Prophecy. Because it was prophesied in the Old Testament that things had to play out like they did. They worked. The things played out exactly how God predicted they were going to play out. How he predestined for them to play out. Again, how people cannot believe in predestination, I don't know. How you cannot look at this story within itself and see that predestination is false. And I know there are some who will say, well, well, this is what true predestination is. It has nothing to do with God's elect. Well, that's false. That's ignorant. That's ignorance is what that is, if that's what you believe. Because God's predestination is all through the Scripture. It's all through His elect, all down through history. So God predestined these things to happen. He prophesied that these things were going to happen. The prophets in the Old Testament prophesied. John the Baptist prophesied of these things. Jesus prophesied of these things. But the Scriptures must be fulfilled. It had to happen this way or the prophecies were false. It happened exactly how the prophecies said they were going to happen. Verse 50, and they all forsook him and fled. Who was this? Well, but notice one thing here with Mark, and again, for a lack of time, I'm not going to go to the other three Gospels, but in the other three Gospels, you see more detail on this. You see where here he says, and they all forsook him and fled. Well, who was it? It was his apostles. They got scared and ran. Jesus told them they would. He told them while he was talking with them after the Lord's Supper. He told them that was going to happen, and they didn't believe him. Remember when they were pridefully saying, "Oh, we'll stand by you. We'll go to death with you." Did any of them die on the cross with him? No. Were any of them there? Well, it appears that at least John was there with him, with his mother anyway, with Mary, with Jesus' mother Mary. The rest of them hid. We'll see in a little bit where Peter at least followed him through the trial, but he stood back in the crowd and actually was in a totally different room than where the trial was going on. And when he was called out by someone else, what did he do? He did just as Jesus told him he would do. He denied him. They all forsook him and fled. And there followed him a certain young man, having a linen cloth cast about his naked body, and the young man laid hold on him. And he left the linen cloth and fled from them naked. Now, this is the only place this is recorded in the Gospels about this young man. Nowhere else. I've heard sermon upon sermon preached on this, and people trying to say that, well, this had to be John because that's the one who Jesus loved the most. He was probably the youngest of the apostles. Others come up with somebody else. There's no indication at all who this is. There's no name given. There's no mention of him being one of the apostles at all. It just says a certain young man having a linen cloth cast about his naked body. Now, why would one of the apostles be dressed like that? They wouldn't have been. Remember, up until this point, they had been traveling. They would not have been dressed like that as they were traveling. They would have not been dressed like that if they'd went for a meal. If they had been in the garden with Jesus that night while he was praying, remember they kept falling asleep and couldn't stay awake waiting for him? They weren't in their home or in a home or in their place they would have stayed for the night. Would not have been a man in his bedclothes, in his pajamas. We don't know who this was. But the young man laid hold on him. In other words, he tried to grab him, tried to hold him back. And he left the linen cloth and fled from them naked. He ran without his clothes. Again, we don't have no idea who this man was. So we'll leave him at that. Verse 53, and they led Jesus away to the high priest, and with him were assembled all the chief priests and the elders and the scribes. And Peter, so all these guys that had been there when he arrested are now with him with the high priest. And Peter followed him afar off, even into the palace of the high priest. And he sat with the servants and warmed himself at the fire. Now, why would he? What is this? The palace of the high priest. This is where the high priest lived within the temple grounds. They did not go into where the worship part of the temple was for this. That was forbidden. You were not to be doing something that would possibly cause the death of a person in that area. It would have been unholy. They went to where the high priest, the place in the palace where he actually, or in the temple where he actually, in the temple grounds where he actually lived, and that's where they held court. The Sanhedrin would have met there. There were other courts that met there. And remember, even though they're ruled by the Romans at this time, the Romans kind of had a pact with the Jews, with those in Israel, that they could perform their own legal things there as long as it didn't overstep the bounds of the Romans. They were still Roman citizens, but because of their religious orders, they would there were certain things that they could take care of themselves. Now, as far as a death penalty, they could declare a death penalty on a man, but they still had to go before the Roman authorities to make it final. And that's what they wind up doing eventually. But so that's why we see them at the temple, on the temple grounds, at the high priest's palace. You notice he says Peter followed him afar off. He didn't get too close. He didn't want to get involved. He wanted to see what was going to happen so he could report back to the others, but he didn't want to get caught himself. And he sat with the servants and warmed himself at the fire. So it's still cool weather. Remember, this is in the middle of the night. You know how it is here, even around the end of March, first part of April, whenever the Passover would have been. Sometimes we still have cool weather then, don't we? Sometimes it still snows at that time of the year. It's rare, but it does happen. Certainly we still have below freezing temperatures that time of the year at night. So it was cool. They had built a fire for the servants. They were warming themselves while they're waiting on the chief priest and all the council, it says. It's in the very next verse. And the chief priest and all the council, the Sanhedrin council, is who this would have been. This would have been part of those guys were Sadducees and part of them were Pharisees. These are the guys, these are the people, the religious leaders who had been persecuting and taunting and disrupting Jesus' ministry the whole time he was on the scene there. Not just in Jerusalem. Remember, they followed him all over the country. Even in Galilee, they were there with him. The chief priests and all the council sought for a witness against Jesus to put him to death and found none. They couldn't find a witness, a credible witness that they could use to help in their legal proceedings. They had to come up with trumped up charges. And we see that oftentimes today, even in and I think part of what we see here, it's very similar, not totally, but similar to how things are supposed to be done in churches as far as discipline is concerned. You know, they were trying to keep this in the temple, in the Jewish religion. Same way we would do in a church discipline matter. Certainly we would not bring somebody to the point where we would declare that they be put to death. That's not our duty. Now, there are those religious orders that do that. Roman Catholicism. They think they have that authority. They don't, but they think they do. Theirs is probably more like what you see here with the Jews than Baptists would be like. But at the same time, they couldn't find any witnesses against him. What happens if you can't find any witnesses? You drop the matter. That's the common sense way to do it anyway, and that's the common practice. It would have been their common practice in their day, and it appears when we get through reading this part of it, you'll see that was the common thing in their day. If there's not a credible witness, you drop the matter. For many bare false witness against him, but their witness agreed not together. In other words, there were witnesses that came, but they weren't credible. In other words, he says there were many bear false witness against him. There were many false witnesses, but they couldn't agree. Their stories were different. They were trying to tell things on him, but they didn't agree with each other. I have no idea what. There's no really any examples given of what they were telling on him, but I'm sure it had something to do with his ministry and his time on this earth. But none of them agreed. Their stories were different. Their stories didn't match, and you see that today. Even in matters of church discipline, you get two parties that are disagreeing on something, and if their stories match, then you got to take a serious look at it. But if they don't match, if it's just common gossip, like this appears to have been, sometimes it's best to just either leave it alone or, you still have to do some deeper research on it. But here, their witnesses didn't agree with each other. And there arose certain and bare false witness against him, saying, We heard him say, I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and within 3 days I will build another made without hands. But neither so did their witness agree together. So he had mentioned that, remember? Let's look back in. Well, let me see. I think it's in. In John chapter 2, in verse 19, let's start with verse 18. Then answered the Jews and said unto him, What sign showest thou unto us, seeing that thou doest these things? Well, this is at the time that he cleansed the temple. This is the time when he threw the money changers out. And verse 19 says, Jesus answered and said unto them, Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. So we know he wasn't necessarily talking about the temple there in Jerusalem, was he? Talking about his own body. True. And they, being Jews and not being his followers, his true disciples, if you go back to Mark in chapter 14, they bring this up, but they have no idea what he was talking about. And they're so mixed up on the matter, they can't even get the story straight. So it says, We heard him say, I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and within 3 days I will build another made without hands. They couldn't even get the story straight. And notice, you've got the council there of chief priests and the elders there that they've heard these things too. So they're witnesses too, but they can't testify against him because of their position. But also notice that they're the ones that recognize that the stories don't match. Well, we heard him say that too, but that's not what we heard, and so they can't agree. None of them can agree on what they heard or what they thought they heard. Verse 60, And the high priest stood up in the midst and asked Jesus, saying, Answerest thou nothing? What is it which these witnesses against thee? Jesus has said nothing so far. Why would he? These people are a bunch of idiots. They can't get their story straight. He knows what's going to happen, what's what has to happen. But these people are, it's ridiculous. It's so, the charges are so trumped up, it's ridiculous what they're bringing out as witnesses. It's all hearsay. It's all gossip. None of it can be can be founded. And so the chief priest, or the high priest, it says, was like, what do you got to say? You're not saying nothing. What do you got to say? He says, but he held his peace and answered nothing. Again the high priest asked him and said unto him, art thou the Christ, the Son of the Blessed? Well, by him saying this, you would assume that somebody else has already brought this up. And this was the one thing that aggravated it aggravated the priest the most, is because he claimed to be the Son of God. He claimed to be the Messiah. And this is where they finally get him, because they don't believe he is. And Jesus said, I am, and ye shall see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven. Has that happened yet? No, it has not. I read again the other day, somebody, the guy was an all-millennialist and believed that the second coming came in 70 AD when Rome destroyed Jerusalem. Supposedly he thought that and where he gets this from, I have no idea. That people think that Jesus came, that they saw Jesus coming in the clouds in that day, and they think that because Jesus said this at this point in time that we're reading about here, it had to have happened soon after this. Well, it didn't. It doesn't. And when he says coming in the clouds of heaven, when he comes, or he says, when you shall see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven. When does that happen? At the end of the tribulation, doesn't it? It doesn't come when he comes back for his bride, before the tribulation begins. The rest of the world, I don't believe the rest of the world is going to see him when he comes that time. And I think if you study that out, I think we talked about that when we went through the book of Revelation. He comes and calls for his people to meet him in the air. Here, what he's talking about is he's going to come. And the other thing is, the vast majority of these priests were not saved. They weren't even God's elect. If you study this out even more, they wouldn't see him coming for his bride anyway. But he says, and ye shall see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power. When does he come back in all his glory and all his power? Not when he comes back for his bride, but when he comes back to take on the armies of the world at the Battle of Armageddon. And he comes back in the clouds of heaven. Then the high priest rent his clothes and saith, what need we any further witnesses? So the high priest, kind of out of disgust and out of a kind of a there you are kind of attitude, we finally got him. He claims to be the Messiah. He claims to be the Christ. He claims to be the Son of God. Then the high priest rent his clothes and saith, what need we any further witnesses? We don't need any more. He just condemned himself. Well, not really. He just told the truth. He told who he really is. You asked the question, and he'd give you the answer. The truthful answer. Ye have heard the blasphemy. What think ye? And again, this is nothing new. Jesus has admitted this before, in front of the priest, in front of the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the scribes, the high priest, others. They've all heard him say this before. And yet this one time, it's enough to, and they've called it blasphemy before. Remember? Every time he said it, they called it blasphemy. But they never arrested him before, did they? Why? Well, what did we read back in verse 49? The last part of verse 49, but the scriptures must be fulfilled. The other times that he said it, well, it was not time for his arrest. Ye have heard the blasphemy, what think ye? And they all condemned him to be guilty of death. Now this is as far as they could go. Now they could have killed him, but they'd have been in trouble with the Roman authorities if they had. They wanted the Romans to be in agreement with them, so that when he was killed, there wasn't a major uprising with the population there. If they had killed him in the temple at this time, the people would have rose up against him because he had that many followers. I mean, they've seen the crowds, the people that followed him throughout the countryside, the multitudes, thousands of people. And they've seen all those that would gather at the temple every day and listen to him teach and preach. He's got quite a following. Some began to spit on him and to cover his face and to buffet him and to say unto him, but prophesy. The servants did strike him with the palms of their hands. Now, this is the priests and their servants. This is not the multitudes, the people, the common people. This is within the temple grounds. Remember, he's there before the Sanhedrin court. This is the priest. They spit on him, covered his face. It's not very professional acting, is it? You know, how would we react if we saw lawyers or their witnesses in a courtroom? A judge would throw them out, or he should. In this case, the high priest did nothing. Verse 66, and as Peter was beneath in the palace, he was on the ground floor. The Sanhedrin was upon the second floor of the palace there in the temple, and Peter was beneath the palace with the other servants. There cometh one of the maids of the high priest, so one of his close servants, the high priest's servant. And when she saw Peter warming himself, she looked upon him and said, and thou also wast with Jesus of Nazareth. She recognized him. How? Well, they all came with him every day to the temple. How would they not recognize him? He was always with him. But he denied, saying, I know not, neither understood I what thou sayest. And he went out into the porch, and the cock crew. Remember what Jesus had told him earlier that night? It would have been, well, they're coming into morning now. The cock crew, the rooster's crowing. It's beginning to get daylight. But 8-10 hours earlier, when they were finishing up their meal, Jesus had told him what he was going to do, exactly how he was going to do, what he was going to do, exactly how it was going to take place. He said, but he denied him, saying, I know not, neither understand I what thou sayest. He went out into the porch, and the cock crew. And the maid saw him again, the same woman, saw him again, and began to say to them that stood by, this is one of them. She began to rat him out. Why? Well, they really wanted all of them, but that wasn't the plan. That wasn't God's plan. Could they have taken all of them? If they really wanted to get all of them, if it had been God's plan for them to, if they'd have done what they wanted to do, they could have took all 11 of the apostles at this time. But that wasn't God's plan. That's what would have normally happened. Anytime that the Jews had, there had been other men, and Scripture briefly mentions it. If you read historians like Josephus and some others, other Jewish writers, you see where there had been other men who had come along down through history who had claimed to be the Messiah, and especially in New Testament times, or just before Christ came on the scene, Jesus came on the scene. There had been men who had taken several thousand people out into the wilderness and started what we would call a cult. They wondered if Jesus was the same, but remember, because of the miracles he performed, the priest even admitted that he was somebody different. He knew too much of the Scripture, more so than any of those others had. But the common practice is when they caught a man like that, they brought in all his closest confidants, all the ones who were the closest to him, and they killed them all. Here, Peter's right there with them, and they don't catch him. They don't arrest him. He gets out. He denied it again, and a little after, they that stood by said again to Peter, "Surely thou art one of them, for thou art a Galilean, and thy speech agreeth thereto." What do they mean by that? Well, his dialect, he spoke their language, but he had a Galilean dialect. We don't often think about other countries being that way. You know, like here in the U.S., you have people from New England or from the East Coast or the South or the West Coast or the Midwest. You have people that talk differently. They speak English, but their dialect is different. It's the same way, and it was the same way in that day in Judea. You had different dialects. Remember, Galilee was not a place known for having learned people. They were not scholars there. So they were mostly fishermen around where those guys. Remember, Peter was a fisherman. They would have not talked with big words. In other words, and so they recognized right away that he was not from Jerusalem. He was from Galilee. And the only people they knew of from Galilee that were in the city of Jerusalem at that time were with Jesus. But he began to curse and to swear. Not very Christian-like, was it? Saying, "I know not this man of whom ye speak." The very thing he said he would not do, he did it 3 times. And the third time, he cursed and swore. And the second time the cock crew, right after that third time, the cock crew twice, the second time. And Peter called to mind the word that Jesus said unto him, "Before the cock crew twice, thou shalt deny me thrice." And when he thought thereon, he wept. He remembered what the Lord had told him. Like I said, it's just been a few hours since they had that discussion. And when he began to think of what he just did, he wept. He wasn't the brave man that he thought he was he? And oftentimes, aren't we the same way when it comes to standing up for the Lord in certain situations? How many times have we denied him? Not that we denied, maybe we didn't deny him directly, but maybe we didn't say anything when we should have, or maybe we did or said things that we shouldn't have, that made it look like we were denying him, that we weren't one of his. It grieved him greatly, and we'll see more of that later on in the story, but how much it grieved Peter. It grieved Peter, I believe it grieved him the rest of his life, if you want to get down to it. How could it not, that he denied him? What good would it have done for him to go the other way with this at this time? Well, probably they would have arrested him, but that was not the prophecy, was it? And you look at the ministry that the Lord gave to Peter in the book of Acts, and from there on till his death, Peter was one of the great apostles that are talked about in the New Testament. Of so many of them that you hear very little about. You know, Peter ranks up there with John and Paul as far as writing much of the New Testament and starting many of the early churches and having to deal with things to do with the early churches and early missionary work. Remember, him and Peter and John were two of the first ones to go out from the church of Jerusalem and go out and preach the gospel. So it's not that he wasn't somebody important, but he did exactly what the Lord prophesied he would do, and he did maybe what any of us would have done as well if we were in his shoes. That's all we'll have for this morning. We'll pick up with chapter 15 next time. Chapter 15 is another fairly long chapter, so we'll probably make 2 lessons out of that. We won't get to, we'll get through at least to his death next week. We won't get to him going to the grave yet. That comes to be later in the chapter. But and in chapter 16 will concern his resurrection and things that happened after that, before his ascension. So that's all we have for this morning.